ask, and yet it never fails. Like, as the lesson starts, somebody's like, hey, is there something other than today's lesson we could be talking about? Tisk, tisk. All right. Huh? Same spiel. Don't distract me. All right. Okay. What? Manat, stop being a menace. Okay. And yeah. Moving on. So we've already talked about one major catabolic pathway. Define for me a catabolic pathway. Right? Yeah, there you go. Break stuff down. And the catabolic pathway we talked about was what? Glycolysis. Yeah, good. That was like a sort of really organic answer, but it was a good one. We got there, yeah. We call it cellular respiration, sort of in the broader overview, and we looked at the processes specifically of glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, Krebs cycle, with citric acid cycle, and then finally the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. Right, that whole kind of metabolic pathway, where in terms of looking at the glucose, that is a catabolic reaction. Now, of course, if you're looking at ADP and phosphate turning into ATP, well, that's an anabolic process, right? So like these things are often paired with each other. But if we kind of think of the glucose itself, it's being taken apart, it's being dismantled, and the energy from it's being extracted, right? And so we consider that one of our catabolic pathways. Well, that glucose had to be made somewhere. Of course, we know where it's made. Where's glucose made? Plants, that's right. Through the process of photosynthesis. And so we're going to spend the next few days looking at photosynthesis as a counterpoint, as a major anabolic pathway. That makes sense? Now, in a catabolic pathway, we said that it was, again, in terms of that sugar, is that an endergonic or an exergonic pathway in terms of that glucose molecule? Yeah, it is. That's right. It's exergonic, which means what? It releases free energy. So if you look at it from the perspective of the glucose, or looking at it from the perspective of the thing we're metabolizing, it starts out with a lot more energy than its constituent things have at the end. Because by the end of it, it has been oxidized, which means that it's lost electrons, and along the way, it's been oxidized down. All that carbon has been oxidized until it forms carbon dioxide, and all the hydrogens have been oxidized down until they form water, right? And so that's a big loss of energy. That energy gets spread out. Now, again, keep in mind these things are always coupled because all of the things that are reduced along the way, the NADH and eventually the ADP into ATP, well, that's actually an endergonic reaction for those, which is the point of the thing, right? It's to be exergonic for the glucose, get the energy out of it, and be endergonic for those ADP into ATP reactions so that we have that ATP storing the energy. Here we're going to go the opposite way, and we're going to build a big old molecule, in this case, glucose. So we recall from grade 9 science that photosynthesis is the formation of sugars by plants using the sun's light as an energy source. The formula for photosynthesis is... That's what we start with? Oh, good. Well, the job's done. What is it? Yeah, plants need carbon dioxide. And they need what else? Yeah, how many? Wunderschön. And they need energy. And the source of that energy is solar energy, light energy. Which, of course, comes from where? Which, of course, produces energy how? Yes and no. Yes and no. Not just by being hot, because like there are things like, for example, a white dwarf star is just hot. It's a dead star that will just spend millennia cooling down. Our sun is not a white dwarf. It's still in its early main sequence life, which if you remember from grade 9 science, hopefully you remember from grade 9 science, means how does our sun produce energy? The heat is the energy. How does it produce it? Sorry? Yeah. Chemical reaction? Oh, nuclear reaction. What kind of nuclear reaction? Fission? Fission is when you take things apart, when you take the nucleus apart, that's nuclear fission. What is the sun mostly made up of? What's the primary component of the sun? Hydrogen. Can we fission hydrogen? Can we take that nucleus apart? What's in the nucleus of a hydrogen atom? Just proton. I'm not taking that apart. So not fission. What's the other one? Fusion. Yeah. Specifically, hydrogen fuses in a main sequence star. Hydrogen fuses into helium is correct. Good. And that causes a little bit of mass is lost along the way. That gets converted into energy, according to Einstein's equation, equals mc squared. And the way that energy gets released is as electromagnetic radiation, because electromagnetic radiation can move through a vacuum, right? So we aren't heated by contact with the sun, because we're not in contact with the sun. And we're not heated by convection, like the way an oven works, where the air gets hot and the heat moves through the air. We get heated by radiation. So that energy gets released as light. And it gets released as a whole spectrum of light. UV rays and X-rays and gamma rays, which our atmosphere mostly is able to block out in our ionosphere. And then visible light, which our atmosphere largely allows through, right? And so that energy from the sun powers a reaction between CO2. Where does that come from? Sure, yeah, absolutely, or not, or from cats, right? Cats make that too. But where does the plant get it? What did you say? Diamond's here. Okay, you said, okay, no, good. Then I stand by my cat's answer. And that's a good answer. Human beings absolutely make some of the CO2 that plants get. And so do cats, and so do dogs, and so do, interestingly, other trees to some extent. But where is all that found? Possibly in the jazz hands, is what I'm getting from one answer here. Yeah, in the atmosphere, in the air. Very good. And obviously the water comes from where? You gotta be honest, I'm not hearing a single word anybody's saying today. If you can speak a little, I think a combination of me being an old man and my hearing being shot, and then you guys all being tired, so you're all answering just at the absolute bottom of your register and very quietly today. So whoever answers soil, yeah, good. Okay, that's good. Yeah, typically groundwater, right? I.e. Through the roots. And of course, what part of the plant gets the CO2 directly from the air? Yeah, the leaves. Good. Fun fact about the word leaves, it does not start with a T. You don't get paid to think.
No.
Can I say that felt good? I mean, to be clear, you don't get paid at all. Anyway, let's move on. Yeah, whatever. It's all good. I have this credit already. Actually, I don't. I have grade 13 biology. But I got it twice, so that counts. Yeah, I did it twice. Have I never told you why? So embarrassing. I really liked a girl. I like this girl. And at the beginning of grade 13, she was like, hey, Joe, we should sit together in biology. And I was like, yeah, we should. It's like not long, my friend Chris was like, you're not in biology. You've already taken it. I'm like, oh, I'm in biology. So I turned around and walked straight to guidance and said, I need to take grade 13 OAC biology again. And he said, oh, okay. Yeah, well, let's get you signed up. And he said, why? And I said, I want to get a better mark. He's like, you got a 97. It was your best mark last year. I'm like, just put me in the course.
What'd you get?
The second time?
Yeah.
94. I did worse. Anyway, you know, you do what you got to do. The heart wants what the heart wants, right? Anyway. Sorry? I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. Like now? No. At the time? Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And again, you know, the heart wants what the heart wants. And what do we get as a product? Yeah, we get C6H12O6. And we get what? 6O2s. Oh, golly. Golly, gee gosh. Okay. And of course, where does the oxygen go? Yeah, into the air. And then into humans and cats. And I'm assuming some other things.
Just humans and cats need oxygen.
At all. Yeah, humans, cats, that's all. And then what about the sugars? Well, they can be stored as sugars, right? But of course, what else can sugars be turned into? Yeah, sure, absolutely. But I mean, they actually do get converted to amino acids. That is, when we make amino acids in our cells, it actually is by modifying other nutrients. That's true. I'm not going to write here because that's getting into the esoteric of it, but it is true, absolutely. Yeah, what I want to think is, what does a plant actually do with it? It will also build complex carbohydrates, right? So, you know, it'll build cellulose, or it'll build starch, etc. And of course, then what happens is, you know, people will come and eat that, right? The important thing to understand is that this is the low energy state, right? Carbon dioxide is the lowest energy form of carbon you can get. It actually is a lower energy state than even just carbon being on its own, which is where the term oxidation as being the lowering the energy of something comes from, because often if you react something with oxygen, it will find itself in its lowest energy state. Not always, but often. So carbon dioxide is a low energy state. Also a low energy state, water, right? And interestingly, even light just spreading out through the universe is a lower energy state than it being concentrated in one place, right? So this is a relatively low energy state. And this is a relatively high concentration of energy state, right? That was fascinating. I have questions. Which means that this reaction is going from low energy to high energy, which means that we are storing energy, which makes it endothermic. It is also decreasing entropy. It is increasing the order of the system, right? Here we have 12 molecules floating around. Here we have only 7, and one of them is big and complicated. Does that make sense? Yeah, the entropy is increasing. Is that wrong again? Let's try this again. I'm so sorry. The enthalpy is increasing, right? We are storing energy, but the entropy is decreasing. And since delta G equals delta H minus T delta S, you don't need to write this down. I wouldn't write it down. But if you want to. In this case, we said we are storing energy, so that's going to be positive, right? And then we're going to be subtracting. Temperature has to be positive. And in this case, we said that delta S is negative. So we're going to be a positive subtracting a negative, which means that no matter what, delta G is going to be positive. So we could write that if we want. The important thing to know is that this reaction is endergonic. And that means, amongst other things, hi, how you doing? that it's non-spontaneous. And when we say non-spontaneous, what's that mean? Sorry? Sure, yeah. And I mean, nothing in the universe is planned when we're talking chemical reactions. So when we talk about it in terms, when something is spontaneous, it happens without planning, right? It doesn't need to be planned, or more to the point, it doesn't need to be directed. It just happens. So a spontaneous reaction will just happen naturally by itself. This reaction will not naturally happen by itself. It may happen in nature. We think that occasionally in nature, if conditions are just right, sugars will form, but that has to be because some sort of outside thing is happening. A bolt of lightning, a blast of heat, or in this case, a series of reactions guided by proteins. But left to itself, you can leave a room full of carbon dioxide and water, and you can turn the lights on all day long, and left to itself, this reaction isn't going to happen. Does that make sense? It just isn't. There's no reason for it to happen unless you change some of the conditions. And if you've taken grade 12 chem, we've talked about some of the ways you can modify a chemical reaction to make one outcome more likely than the other. But left to itself, this is a non-spontaneous reaction. And that means that it requires a catalyst. It needs something to make it happen, even if we didn't want to do it in a directed way. Does that make sense? If you remember, sugars burn naturally just fine. We use a series of reactions and enzymes so we could capture that energy and use it to do stuff. But if you just take sugar and just put it on your stove and let it burn, it'll burn. It'll burn just fine. You ever burn sugar on the stove? Yeah, right? No, it's miserable trying to clean it off, right? Because the little bit of it that doesn't burn melts and then solidifies. So now you have like a hard single sugar crystal structure with a whole bunch of burnt sugar inside of it, right? This is not good. It's no good. That is the key, right? And then use like some soap and a little scrub. But yeah, it's not fun. So in this course, we'll get a little bit more specific than that about what's going on. We know that plant leaves are green. So I want you to jump back into your grade 10 chemistry now, or grade 10 science rather. This diagram is less useful on your page, though you will note the spectrum is in proper order, starting with red and working its way to the violet. Out of curiosity, if you look here, where does green land in the spectrum? Kind of roughly in the middle of the visible spectrum. What of this is the highest energy light? If we were to draw little wavelengths in here, we could do that. But what has more energy to it, red light or blue light, if it's at the same intensity? Yeah. It is blue. That's the right answer. Sorry? Not chemistry, grade 10 science. Did I not do 10 optics?
I did grade 10 science online in the summer.
Oh, God. Okay. Well, that's okay. Like, you'll be fine. But that's a shame because the optics is like my favorite unit in that course. I think it's so endlessly fascinating. So if you remember, the red light has these sort of longer wavelengths. And by the time we get to the violet light, it has very narrow wavelengths. And then you have ultraviolet light, which isn't even visible to us, and it has much faster wavelengths. And if you ever have trouble remembering which is the high energy, long wavelengths for short, just imagine you're trying to make waves. You ever in a pool and you try to make waves? If you're trying to make them far apart from each other, imagine moving your hands like that. And then if you're trying to have the waves be really close to each other, how would you have to move your hands? Really quickly, right? Which one of those is more work if you're trying to push water quickly, right? Which is literally, all these waves are is waves that move all the electrons in the universe. So, it's going to take more energy to move all the electrons in the universe quickly than to do so slowly. We can say that the red side of the spectrum is lowest energy of visible light. And the violet side is the highest energy. I'm not going to even mention frequency, which is the inverse of wavelength, but we will talk about wavelengths a lot. So I'm also going to say these have the shortest wavelengths. What is wavelength, by the way? It's literally the length between two peaks of a wave. I'm going to rewrite that because I think that's embarrassing looking. You might be thinking, this is the moment Orlando decides to get embarrassed after his long life of being embarrassing, but whatever. This is my moment. And red has the longest wavelengths. And this is another one of those things where just quickly, it might be counterintuitive that longest would be low energy and shortest would be high energy, but oh, I like that. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's a very good way to think of it. So now, what I want to get away from this is, what color do leaves look like? They look green. What light are leaves absorbing? Not the green light. Does that make sense? And it's so easy to forget that because we think like, oh yeah, plants are green energy, this or that. But guess what? If you took a plant and shone green light on it, is it going to grow? No. That's the one color of light that it couldn't possibly use because we know it doesn't even ever get into the leaves. Because what color are leaves? Green. And so what are they doing with almost all of the green light? Reflecting it. The cool thing is they do absorb other colors. They do reflect other colors of light too. They reflect most of the really red and orange light as well. And you know this because the first pigment to kind of break down in leaves, the one that is sort of the most volatile, is the one that reflects all that green light. Does anyone know what that pigment is called? The pigment in leaves? Chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is the pigment that is responsible for reflecting all that green light. When it breaks down, it doesn't like the cold. So when it gets cold outside, chlorophyll becomes unstable. It becomes kind of denatured. The protein exists in becomes denatured. And all of a sudden, chlorophyll, no good to us anymore. And you can actually see that on the plant. You can tell when a plant's chlorophyll is dying because it stops reflecting green light. That tells you its chlorophyll isn't working anymore. What color are the leaves when that happens? They tend to be kind of brown and orange and red, right? And that's because this end of the spectrum also gets absorbed, just not as much as the green. We have way more chlorophyll in the leaves. So when there's chlorophyll present, we don't notice that's reflecting a bunch of orange and yellow but mostly orange and red light at us. And then as soon as that chlorophyll dies off, we can really notice the other pigments in there as well. Which means, where is the plant absorbing and using most of its light? The light it's actually using? Well, beyond the green. Beyond the green in the blues and violets, the high energy light. Does it make sense that that's the portion of the light that the plant wants to use? Does that make sense? You might think, why not use all the light? Well, the answer is, it's going to get hit by all the light at once, and you can only absorb, a photon at a time, a packet of light at a time. So if your choice is between absorbing all of the light at a time or adapting so that you're always absorbing and using the highest energy ones, which one makes the most sense for the plant? Well, the answer is the high energy. So the pigments of a plant, the pigments in plants, in the leaves, reflect almost all green light, and most of the red and oranges. I should say, sorry, yeah, absolutely. Where is it? It is. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Beautiful. And much of the orange and red. That should be a period. Don't know why I put a comma. Thus, it uses the high energy, shorter wavelength light to power photosynthesis. Later on in this course, you're going to design a lab of your own, and a really classic student lab is to, grow plants and control the color of light that they're exposed to, and see how they grow under different colors of light. Even better than that, we have some sensors here, and I've had students in the past shine different colors of light on plants and in real time measure their carbon dioxide consumption and oxygen production. We have both a CO2 sensor and an O2 sensor. That would be a great idea for when it comes time to design your own lab. It's something that you can do fairly controllably. We've got a variety of lights around here that can control the color you shine on them. I'm actually curious to see. I've got these LED lights now where we can dial in the wavelength fairly discreetly. They probably won't work because they don't dial in the wavelength discreetly. They actually only have red light, blue light, and green light, then it mixes them. That's interesting. But we could at least compare red, blue, and green very accurately. Yeah. So the answer is what we see as different colors. Light isn't colored. What we perceive as color is just light having different levels of energy. So what makes it have different colors is that we have optic sensors called rod cells and cone cells, and the cone cells are designed. We have 3 different types, and they are designed to respond to different wavelengths. And so the 3 types that respond to different wavelengths send signals to our brain, and our brain then maps those different wavelengths and presents that information to us as color, but that is our brain interpreting the energy level of the light that is blasting around in the room. So when we talk about light being different colors, that is a brain perception. And this is the classic, the first time a university student gets stoned going how do I know if the red I see is the same as the red you see, man? That kind of thing. And the answer is, I don't know. We don't know. It doesn't matter. But what we do know is that is our brain interpreting something that does have a physical reality, which is that electromagnetic radiation can have different levels of energy, which is a function of how narrow or how wide its wavelengths are. And there's a small section of that our eyes are designed to be able to intercept and interpret. But of course, red light is the exact same stuff as microwave rays, which is the exact same stuff as radio waves, which is the exact same stuff as X-rays and gamma rays. It's just all different levels of energy. There's this very narrow window of that we're able to see. Some animals can see a narrower range. Your dogs have much less sensitive color vision than you have. They make up for it by having much better ability to receive light, so they can see way better in the dark, but they don't see nearly as much color information. And then you have a mantis shrimp that can see down into the infrared, up into the UV, and with way more color resolution. They can see literally billions of times more colors than you can. When they see the rainbow, they see something just fantastically more complicated than what you see. I would have to ask them. Maybe they also just started university. I can't tell you. But right, me too. I've always heard of this, and then I've never seen an actual report of somebody where that's been confirmed. So it's something I've always been on the lookout for. What we know is there are definitely people who only have 2 functioning cone cells, and they can't see the same level of color difference that we can. And that we call these people having red-green color blindness. And then there's a whole nother swath of people where one of the cone cells is still present but doesn't work as well. That, by the way, much more common in men than women because that is a sex-linked trait. It's on the X chromosome, if you remember your grade 11 biology. So there's one allele where that cone cell just doesn't work at all, and that's true in complete color blindness. And then there's also multiple alleles where it doesn't function as well. And so, there are a lot of people in the world who have much less ability to differentiate between colors, and then some who can't at all. I believe Mr. Ventnor is colorblind, if I'm not mistaken. I always remember my friend Brandon, who's a doctor now, in grade 11 biology, he discovered that he was colorblind. And so we did like a colorblindness test in grade 11 biology, and I could see him like perking right up, and I'm like, Brandon, what's going on? And the first thing he said was, now I know why everyone tells me my clothes never match. And yeah, he found out in biology class that he was colorblind. Yeah. Yeah.
And the GM was working in the kitchen with this one guy and myself, and she kept getting mad at him. She's like, "You're using the wrong colored tongs, look at this and that."
Colorblind?
She like stopped, and then he said, "I don't know what color it is." And then she looked so guilty because she was like flipping out on him.
Well, you realize too, like, think of like our traffic lights. Like, that's a real problem right now. Luckily, in Canada, even if you can't see the colors, where's the red light? Oh God, I hope you know. Top, and in the middle is the amber light, and on the bottom, green. Okay, good. All right, that's good. Oh God, I'm so glad that you could all start to. Okay, hold up. I just want to be clear. Exactly 0 hands went up to knowing which light is where. How many of you have a beginner's license? Hands up. That could be worse, but oh dear God, we'll talk. All right, trying to take you two on Papa Joe's driving lessons. I'm a very good driving instructor. Right? Oh, even better. Oh, good. You're just out there doing your thing. Wonderful. That's great. Are you colorblind?
I'm blind.
Well, that's its own problem. But anyway, I will say, there's some kids who like come in and they'll be like, I got my license. And you're always like, yay, good for you. And then I also think I'm going to start using public transit, Just like, what's fun? The bus. Anyway, I mean, it's not always true, is it? But we're going to dig into this fairly deeply. We're going to have to understand a little bit of that grade 10 light stuff. Don't worry. If you forget it, we're going to reteach it. But it's going to come up. Yeah.
If it like dies off, it turns brownish.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like what happens in the fall when the colors?
Yeah, exactly right. And not the next lab we're doing, but the lab after that, we're actually going to take some spinach, we're going to mash it up, and we're going to take that green pigment out. And then we're going to use a couple of different tools to break that pigment up and see that actually there's not one pigment in plants, but a bunch. And you'll see the different colors of the different pigments. And what you're going to find is, oh yeah, that green that I see all summer, I can see where that pigment is. And then the red and the brown that we see in the fall were actually there the whole time. They were just being hidden by the green. Yeah. Oh. They have, okay, long story short, they have different pigments, and not something I know a lot about. Now, the interesting about fruits being pigmented is, it's like flowers being pigmented. That has nothing to do with their energy function or anything like that. Fruits aren't photosynthesizing. Flower petals aren't photosynthesizing. Do you know why, our best understanding of why flowers adapted to be very colorful and fruits adapted to be very colorful? Yeah, so in the terms of flowers, that's where pollination needs to occur, and we want to attract bees. And then why the fruit? What's in the fruit? Seeds. So,
Animals could eat it, they would be temperature, and they won't eat the plant.
no, exact opposite. They will eat the plant. They'll eat the fruit. And the whole point of a plant, remember, in evolutionary terms, you have 2 jobs, to survive and to reproduce, right? Like, in terms of evolution, obviously, in your life, definitely take the survival part to heart. We want that. As for the reproduction, that's entirely up to you. But in terms of evolution, in terms of, a species surviving and thriving, it's organisms need to live long enough to reproduce, at least enough of them to reproduce, and they need to reproduce successfully, right? So for a plant, even if an animal eating the plant kills that plant, if it eats the seeds, what's the advantage? It's going to take that and it's going to move it somewhere else, right? So that plant will then be able to, one animal eats this berry, another animal eats that berry. Those seeds are going to get spread now wherever those animals go. And then even better, Kiki?
I was going to say you should get a class pet. You should be a fly trap.
I would love that. I've always wanted a class pet. And then I'm bad with animals and I'm bad with plants. I'm just worried I'm going to get a class pet and then kill it, and then all my students would hate me. That's the only thing that stops me from being that teacher that has like 50 animals in his classroom. I'm just worried that I would do a bad job.
Last year they grew beans really well, so I think you can trust us with gardening beans.
But then the summer came and they all got left on the windowsill and they all died. So now what happens when it's not a bean plant, but it's a ferret? Then we've killed a ferret. Are you at peace with that, Toby? Because I'm not. Do you see what I'm saying? I would love to have like a class owl. I love owls. Or like, I love birds. My daughter had a bird, and Nyx was like my favorite thing in the world. I would play guitar, and Nyx would land on the headstock of my guitar and like chirp along, or I'd play piano, and she would sit on my shoulder and literally sing in my ear while I played piano. And she wasn't bad. She had good pitch, and I miss Nyx a lot. Class dog would be amazing. I love dogs. But like, not everyone loves dogs. Some people are scared of dogs. This is one thing, can I say, I'm a dog guy. I love dogs. But this is something I wish dog owners would get in their head. You know what everyone isn't? A dog person. And so like, I love my dog, but you can't be one of these dog owners who like, everywhere you walk, you take your dog off the leash, just like let him run around. And then you say things like, he's really friendly. And he's like running up and jumping at people who are like terrified. Like you just because you're a dog person doesn't mean that person is a dog person. And in the end, here's the deal. I love dogs, but like a dog is a wild animal. It really is. Yes, they're domesticated, this or that, but they're still an animal. They aren't sentient in the way that we are. We don't think. They act on instinct. And like, dogs flip and like do dangerous things sometimes, right? Like every breed at some point, one of them will. And people say, oh, there's no bad dogs and owners. And that's true, right? In the end, you need to be sure that you can control your dog. And when I see like some like 80-pound person walking around with like 220-pound dogs, I'm like, that's just not in the city. I'm like, that's not appropriate. I get it. I like big dogs. But like, you live in a city full of other people. You want a big old dog and you're a little guy? Go live in the country, you know, where you can do that. You can put a fence up or something. You live in the city, you got a big old dog. You got to know that you can stop your dog, like, from doing something if it snaps, right? I love Ruby, but if I had to smother Ruby to death, my other dog, or not you, my dog Ruby. Oh, I didn't even think of that. That's weird. Nobody's into the name Arlo either, right? I love Ruby, my dog, who my sister has stolen. I love Arlo, my dog that I currently own. But I know that in either case, if I had to, like, you know, just knock him down, I'm good, right? Because dogs are animals, and animals do crazy things. Just like cats. You know what cats are?
Vicious.
Cats are godless killing machines. All right? Do you know why your cat doesn't kill you? There's two reasons. One, because you feed it, and two, because its mouth isn't big enough. Like, and just to be clear, if its mouth was big enough, your cat would eat you. Right? You know, it's like giving you like love. No, it's attempting to consume you and discovering that it can't, so at least it will just let you feed it. But like, that's what animals, you know, like they're animals. They're not people. By the way, you know, push comes to shove, a person would probably eat you too if they had to. Yeah.
What do you mean by high energy sugar that
Yep. So again, light isn't like the red as a color is your brain receiving a bunch of wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, and your brain calls this red. And then if that electromagnetic radiation is a little bit higher energy, which means that the waves are being produced such that they're closer together, a little bit more, your brain has a sensor that receives that as green. And then if it's even more than that, your brain has a sensor that perceives that as blue. The color is just your interpretation of it. The actual thing is a wave of electromagnetic radiation, which literally means a wave moving through space where, I don't have time to reteach the whole grade 10, but the basic idea is this, that anywhere in the world an electron moves, this is actually, everyone look at me, except the people sleeping, who I'm going to let sleep because they seem tuckered out, even though it hurts my feelings and makes me feel like an ineffective teacher. But that's okay. All an electromagnetic wave is this. There's actually a force of attraction between every single electron in the entire universe, but it depends on how close you are. Does that make sense? But if you move an electron anywhere in the whole universe, it causes motion in the other ones. If you move at fairly slow speeds, that effect is pretty negligible, and it's more than balanced out by all the other forces, strong nuclear force, this, that. But the actual orbiting of electrons, and then like the vibration of molecules, that's fast stuff. And so all these electrons shake and they pull on all the other ones. And that's all light is, which is how fast an electron is moving somewhere. So everything is producing light at all times, including you. You're not hot enough, your electrons aren't moving fast enough, that the light you produce is visible to our eyes, interestingly, the light you produce is visible to some animals, and it's visible to cameras we make, because the light you produce all the time by the motion of your electrons is in what we call the infrared range, below red. Our eyes can't see it. What an evolutionary advantage that would be, right? Imagine if you could see the light that things produce all the time. You wouldn't need light in a room. You could just see everything, but we didn't evolve that. Some animals have, which is interesting. They can literally see in the dark. They don't need the sun's light to reflect off something. They can see the light things make. But if things get hotter, which is one of the ways to make higher energy light, there's other ways, heat isn't the only one, but heat will work. We don't want to get people this hot because bad things happen. If you take a piece of metal, we did this in grade 10. The first lab I do in grade 10 optics is we take a piece of metal, we put it under a Bunsen burner and let it get hot, and we look at it. And the hotter it gets, it starts to glow. And when it first starts to glow, it glows as a really dull red you can barely see. Then as it gets even hotter, it will glow as red, and that's because the electrons are moving faster, which means the radiation they're producing is moving faster. After red, it'll go orange, and that's usually as hot as we can get a piece of metal to go with a Bunsen burner. But if you got a welding torch out and you keep heating it up, it'll go really yellowy, and eventually it'll go white, which means that we're still getting some of that red and orange, but now all the other colors are blending in too, because what we see as white light is really just all these colors mixing together. Now, the good thing for us is that we don't need to be in a super hot room to get white light, because the sun is super hot and it shoots that light out at us, and by the time it gets to us, we're not feeling the heat of the sun, but we are seeing its electromagnetic radiation. Did that answer your question? Great. Any other questions about that? Again, this isn't a physics class. We don't need to have light theory down completely, but there is one more thing we're going to say about light, which is, on this page still, before we go to the next. If you took physics or chem, so if you took SPH4U or SCH4U, in other words, 4U physics or 4U chemistry, you'll know a little bit about quantum theory. Can anyone really quickly give me the basic idea of quantum theory?
You get too small things start getting chaotic.
That's definitely true. And the reason for that is, or just your answer. Yeah, that was a good answer. Those are both good answers. What was yours? Yeah, very good. And when they do so, they always move to specific spots, right? They don't just go anywhere. They can jump from this energy level to that energy level, but they can't be anywhere in between. Those were actually three really good answers, and they kind of hit it in three different ways. The idea of quantization is that things can only exist in certain discrete amounts. How that applies to us is that everything is made of atoms, and we have these electrons that have energy levels, and they bounce around. And at the small scale, at a big scale, things can just move gradually from place to place. But at the small scale, it's very different. Things can exist at this energy level or at that energy level, but nowhere in between. So the model we use of the atom, where we imagine electrons orbiting like planets around a sun, isn't accurate, because the orbits of the planets around the sun are always gradually changing. And our orbit is a different energy level this year than the year before. And our moon's orbit around us, which is really just the moon's orbit around the sun that kind of interacts with us, is also changing. The moon gets a little further from us every year. We get a little further from the sun. Not going to matter, because the sun will have consumed us by turning into a red giant long before that matters. But the point being, those energy levels are always changing. But in the atom, at the small scale, it doesn't work that way. Things come in discrete packages. And that means that when you think about light, you have to think of it as two things at once. And it's not really two things at once. This is where quantum theory gets messy, where it is a wave. It is a wave propagating out through the universe. And yet you've probably heard of wave-particle duality at some point. They would have mentioned it in physics. I usually passingly mention it in grade 10 optics. But this idea that even though light is a wave that spreads, you also have to think of it almost as being a particle. Because even though it is a continuous wave that spreads out in every way, it works in quantum levels, which means its energy levels can only change in discrete quantized amounts. It has to change by a certain amount, and it changes immediately and directly. which means that light is a wave, but it's a wave that will behave as if it's a particle. Does that make sense? And for the purpose of this course, you don't have to understand why that is. You don't have to make sense of it. It's a great topic to dig into. And there's like 8 levels of understanding of that, ranging from the level we need in this course, which is just me saying, trust me when I tell you light is a wave, but also we're going to talk about particles of light. And even though that sounds like a contradiction, you just got to trust me that that's okay, that's cool, that works. The next level beyond that would be to read like grade 11 physics textbook and hear what it has to say about it. And then grade 12, and you could watch some YouTube videos that explain it sort of by analogy, and that will all build your understanding. In the end, the final understanding is you'd have to sit down and actually do the math that explains this. You'd have to break out Maxwell's equations and Schrodinger's equations and Einstein, and you'd have to actually get there. But for this course, we don't need you to break out Maxwell's equations and Schrodinger's equations and Einstein. I don't need you to be Stephen Hawking, all right? You can operate totally on level 1, which is you just have to trust me when I tell you light is a wave that travels continuously in all directions and is uninterrupted. And also, there's little particles of light, and we're going to deal with light one particle at a time. Even though, is it actually a particle? No. But it kind of is. What it isn't is it isn't a thing that has mass and moves around like that. But we can take, if you think of a particle as a quantized individual piece of something, because energy always gets absorbed in discrete amounts, quantized amounts, you can absorb a specific portion of light. And you can't absorb less than that. And if you want to absorb more than that, it has to be like twice as much, or maybe 1.5 times as much. But it's going to be a defined amount. And in that sense, again, just operating at that level 1 understanding, light is a continuous wave. But when it interacts with things, by virtue of it being in this quantum realm, we can talk about particles of light. And does anyone know what we call a particle of light? Photon. Coming from photos, which is the Greek word for light. And then that N ending makes it sound like all the other particles. Ions, positrons, protons, neutrons, electrons. Yeah. I would love to have done both. I wish I did. My wife did both. I would say Latin is the more accessible because it shares our alphabet. So if you study Greek, you have to learn a whole second alphabet, which, like I remember my wife's first day of Greek homework was learn the Greek alphabet and know it by next week because you're going to have to be able to use it fluently. So that was intimidating. I will say that she spent a lot of time studying both. I think my wife used to spend about, I would say conservatively, 15, 20 hours a week studying Greek. The Latin never seemed to be as tricky for her. So I would say if you're only going to do one, I would do the Latin, especially because the Latin more directly comes up in sort of our day-to-day lives because of our roots as coming from English culture and English culture's roots of having been conquered by the Romans. It directly comes to us through the English side of things, and then it also comes to us through French and Italian and Spanish, and all those, what we call Romance languages, are all descendants of Latin as well. So I would say it is a wonderful thing to study. It used to be mandatory starting in elementary school. And I kind of think, given its prominence in our culture, it still should be. Also, I think that learning difficult things is good for you. So I would highly endorse, yes.
For the 6 colors, like the red to violet one,
Yeah.
are there more?
To be clear, there are not 6 colors. There's, okay, ready? Theoretically, an infinite number of wavelengths, though again, not actually because of quantization. But long story short, many, many, many different wavelengths of light. This is a continuous rainbow. It's not perfectly continuous. There is an element of discreteness to it, but at such a tiny scale, again, you have to get at a very small scale. Long story short, there are functionally an infinite number of colors. And interestingly, you can only see 3 of them. Yeah, we'll go rewatch my grade 10 lessons if you want to know about that. You actually can only see 3 colors and your brain just fills in the gaps, which is why you can be fooled by this screen right now, which actually only shows 3 colors. There's only ever red light, green light, or blue light coming out of that screen. And it would never fool a mantis shrimp. A mantis shrimp would look at this and go, that looks crazy, that looks ridiculous. But it can fool you because you can only see 3 colors. And it's not quite true. What you see is 3 ranges of colors. You have one sensor that kind of sees this whole range, and then you have another sensor that sees this whole range, then you have another sensor that sees this whole range. And the trick is that because those ranges overlap, your brain can then interpolate where the difference might be. Because if we're getting a ton off this sensor and nothing off this sensor, then your brain's like, ooh, that's red. It must be mostly over here. Whereas if we're getting a ton off this sensor and still quite a bit off this sensor, then it knows like, oh, that must be in the yellow. Whereas if it's getting a ton off the middle one and only a little bit off this side, it's like, okay, that's light green. Whereas if it's getting a ton off this sensor, nothing off this one, a bit off that one, it's like, ooh, that's dark green. So we have incredibly crude color vision. And the crazy thing is, even with incredibly crude color vision, literally 3 sensors to see a functionally infinite number of colors, look at all the different colors we can see. You break that down to 2 color sensors. Now you're in the realm of people who are red-green colorblind. A lot of animals, dogs, for example, only have 2 color sensors. I don't know for cats. Who knows? But anyway, I have to talk to someone more. But the point being, with just a very rudimentary thing, we can still see a lot of variety of colors. And if you added just one more sensor, that would multiply by the billions. If you add one more after that, it would multiply by like just the trillions. Like it would grow exponentially. But as it stands, for this course, the only thing you need to know is this. For this course, what you need to know that light is a wave that behaves like a particle. And that is a gross simplification, but we're going to take it. That light is a wave that at small scales behaves like a particle. And that particle is called the photon. And again, it comes from photos, which is light, and then that on ending is just how we name all of the particles, all the elementary particles in physics. So photos is light. That's a primer of basically all of the physics. Well, sorry, one more thing, but that's a primer of most of the physics you need for this course. Okay? That'll get us there. So now, this shows how light gets absorbed with handy-dandy little rainbows. Again, the fact that leaves are green means what color aren't they absorbing? Green. And the fact that underneath that green we know we have some browns and reds and oranges means that they're also not absorbing those, right? Could we measure this? Yeah, what we could do is we could take the leaf, we could shine some light through it, and we could slowly change the color of that light and see how much light gets through as we go through the colors. Does that make sense? And we have a machine that does that. It's called a spectrophotometer. We don't have one here. I wish we did. We could probably make one. But it's not easy. You can't do it with like LEDs or something. You have to actually change the color of light, which is where it gets expensive. And what we find with plants is that this is where they absorb very well. Now keep in mind that this is the light they are absorbing. Right? Which means all of this light is the light that they are, and I'm going to draw that in green because it really is mostly in the green. If you look, you see that the big reds are not absorbed. Does that make sense? Kind of the oranges, we get a big peak here, but mostly the reds are not absorbed. And then if we look here, yellows and greens are not absorbed. Now, what is this measuring on this scale? Wavelength, right? And remember, wavelength is a measure of the distance between peaks. So if that's the blue light, and if you look here, what's the distance between the peaks of blue light, roughly speaking? 440? Yeah. So this might have a wavelength in the range of about 440-ish nanometers. Just looking at it, right? That didn't go well. Let me try that again. So between here and here might be about 440 nanometers. By the way, what's a nanometer? A millimeter is 1/1000th of a meter. A micrometer is 1/1000th of a millimeter. And if you cut that micrometer into 1,000 pieces, one of those is a nanometer. So we're talking about a very small distance. On the other hand, the red wavelength, way up here, would have wavelengths twice as long, right? Like that. And what's the distance between those? About 700 nanometers. I drew that too big by comparison, but that's okay. You get the idea. You're okay. You're tough. How's that? Is that better? Good. I'm glad for you. So what we want to note here is that there's only narrow spectrums of light that the plant actually uses. Yes, the plural of spectrum is a. Things that end in um get pluralized with an a in Latin-rooted words. So, for example, we would say a bunch of stadiums, but the actual pluralization is stadia. Things like that are falling out of course, but the big place you see it is media. Like we talk about the media. The interesting thing is that's a stupid word to use because we're saying the plurals of something, like the cats. But that's okay. If media is plural, and that is a way that information gets disseminated. So when we talk about all the ways information gets disseminated, we talk about the media. If we're talking about one way that information gets transmitted, we call that a medium, which is, so we talk about one medium of information would be news. Another medium would be TikTok videos, which is where most of you people get your news, which is problematic, might I add. We'll talk about that at a later date. We use the word medium in that way all the time. We talk about how light is a wave that can travel without a medium. It can travel and it doesn't need something to carry it. It just travels on its own through the universe. So spectra is the plural of spectrum. And so we call this, that the plant absorbs and can use. And we call this its absorption spectrum. This is also like a way that we can identify chemicals. Yet another way we can identify chemicals is we can put them in a spectrophotometer and see what colors of light they absorb and what colors they don't. And that can be a very powerful tool for identifying things. If you take first-year chemistry at university, at least if they teach what they used to, you'll learn about UV vis, ultraviolet and visible spectrophotometry, which is this, but you'll also learn about infrared spectrometry, which is down here lower. And the interesting thing about infrared spectrophotometry is that the actual bonds between like carbon and hydrogen and carbon and oxygen, hydrogen, those bonds will absorb infrared light. And so you can actually figure out all the types of bonds that are in a compound by looking at how they absorb UV light, or infrared light rather. And by how much they absorb, you can even figure out how many. So one of the ways we figure out the structure of something is if you shine infrared light through it, if it's not too big and too complex a molecule, we can say, oh wow, look at this. There's 3 times as many carbon-hydrogen bonds in this molecule as there are carbon-oxygen bonds. And we can tell the difference between a single bond and a double bond, which is really cool. In the visible range, we tend not to get that level of specificity. Individual bonds don't absorb light, but certain molecules absorb light very well. What do we call a molecule that absorbs some light and reflects others? P word. Nope. And let's just stop you now because you're just grabbing random P words and that could become problematic. Pigments. Pigments. Yeah, I had to shut that down. Good Lord. Pigments are molecules that absorb some regions of light and reflect others. And I know we didn't get far on this note, but I wanted to go slowly with the light stuff because I've taught this in the past and just been like, you guys all remember grade 10 light stuff? Let's write down and move on. And then I found that people are scared for the rest of the unit. Does that make sense? We don't want to be scared for the rest of the unit. We want to just go calmly. So pigments are molecules that absorb some colors of light, and I'm going to say some wavelengths of light. We want to get away from talking about color because, again, color is just an interpretation. Wavelength is an actual property of the light. So absorb some wavelengths of and I'm going to say EMR. What does that stand for? Electromagnetic radiation, which is what light is, but is also what radio waves are. And we think of radio waves and microwaves as being very different because light has this weird property that we can see it with our eyes, and we can't see radio waves with our eyes. Be cool if we could. We can't. But of course, we can build telescopes that see radio waves, and that lets us see things in the universe that our eyes can't. We can build telescopes that see microwaves, and we can all that. So anyway, pigments are molecules that absorb some wavelengths of EMR and reflect others. And the other way to say that, I'm not going to write here, but you could say pigments absorb some photons of light, right? They will absorb certain energy levels of photons, but they will reflect others. What's a photon again? It's a light particle or a discrete package of light. It's a quantized packet of light. And when we talk about a photon, the only thing you need to describe a photon is its wavelength. Does that make sense? If you describe the wavelength of a photon, you're talking about a discrete packet of maybe 680 nanometer light, hypothetically speaking, for example. By the way, looking at this spectrum, what color would a 680 nanometer wavelength of light be? Well, that's 600. This would be 700. 680 would be what, about there? So yeah, not red, not yellow, definitely in the orange range, right? What if we absorbed 300 nanometer wavelength of light? Ultraviolet. What if the wavelength of EMR was actually like long? What if it was like 2 meters? We use those wavelengths because they're so long that things like trees and buildings are small relative to them and they don't really interfere with it. It can just pass right through them because it's not even there. What kind of EMR is that? Radio. We use it to send information, right? So there we go. And if you look here, these are the individual pigments. Last thing we'll write before we go. These are the primary pigments of photosynthesis. So we're going to do a lab where we take spinach leaves and we break its we break the leaves down and we extract the pigments from them. But of course, when we extract them, they're going to be all together, right? And if you've ever mashed up leaves before, the liquid just looks what color? It looks green, which makes sense because that liquid's absorbing all the green. And then we're going to use some tools to actually break this into chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and the carotenoids, which are actually a bunch of different pigments. So I hope that was useful. I know it's kind of slow going, but congratulations on surviving photosynthesis part 1, day 1. I'll see you tomorrow for photosynthesis part 1, day 2. Dead reckoning. Yes. Yeah, I'm all ears. How you doing, by the way? How'd your craft show go? Did you make any sales?
Yeah.
Awesome. That's awesome. I wanted to buy something, by the way. I wasn't able to come to that craft show, but I was going to get my wife something nice. You'll have to show me what you have for sale. Buy something.
I was posting some on marketplace and stuff because I had a bunch of leftover stuff.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to take a look to that and see if there's something I could buy. Over $100. And can I ask, how much did it cost you to make that stuff?
Okay, well, the stuff didn't cost me a lot.
Yeah.
It was more like because I had to handle candy.
Yeah.
And I needed like 2,000 pieces of candy.
Yeah. So what would that cost you?
$200.
That's so funny. That's okay. But you get your name out there and people recognize you. Like in business, they always say you got to spend money to make